attitude was a necessary defense mechanism to handle the ambiguity of predestination. Fueled by our underlying Hobbesian fear, the Calvinist lived a life with a superimposed self-confidence, which led him to pursue his worldly affairs with the utmost diligence. In a Freudian sense, the Calvinist was projecting the aggressive energy from his insecurity out onto the world, thus making him a diligent capitalistic accumulator. This spirit of perpetual accumulation is best explained by the new limitlessness placed on the amount of good deeds one could do. About 2 centuries after the Reformation, Emile Durkheim would describe this idea of limitlessness as a state of anomie. Indeed, Durkheim believes that this anomie lends itself to capitalism. Quote, "In the sphere of trade and industry, anomie, is anachronex that economic progress has mainly consisted in freeing industrial relations from all regulation." End quote. With the power of predestination in God's hands, the Protestant had an exclusive trust in God, and thus, little social trust. This new pessimistic individualism emerging in this new state of anomie is elucidated in Durkheim's elaboration on an anomic society. Quote, "To pursue our goal, which is by definition unattainable, is to condemn oneself to a state of perpetual unhappiness." End quote. In the Reformation, we begin to see a heightened pessimistic individualism further accentuated by the narcissistic traits espoused by some of the Protestant sects. Individualism, epitomized in the Calvinist notion that God helps those who help themselves, could be enhanced by productive activity manifested as material accumulation. Therefore, during the Reformation, individualistic people wished to show signs of divine election through ceaseless material accumulation, as there was no limit to the good deeds that could be done. In addition, luxurious consumption was seen as a sign of sin. Thus, the Protestants became extremely wealthy. Quote, "When the limitation of consumption is combined with this release of acquisitive activity, the inevitable practical result, if obvious, accumulation of capital through ascetic compulsion to save." End quote. Indeed, this puritanical pursuit of wealth as an end in itself seems to clearly point to an insecurity stemmed from an ambiguous destination in the afterlife. So is this aggressive energy from the theological insecurity synonymous with Adam Smith's notion of the quote, "natural effort of every individual to better his own condition." End quote. And does this insecurity explain why this effort, quote, "is so powerful that it is alone, and without any assistance, capable of carrying on the society to wealth and prosperity." End quote. Indeed, modern day interpretation would assert that man's natural effort has a scientific significance. Weber himself exclaims that religious motives are not found in modern capitalism. Quote, "Today the spirit of religious asceticism, whether finally, who knows, has escaped from the cage. But victorious capitalism, since it rests on mechanical foundations, needs its support no longer." End quote. Is man's natural effort that nourishes capitalism theologically or empirically based? Indeed, Smith does not explicitly answer this, but rather emphasizes that capitalism is a naturalized system with naturally existing characteristics. We can fairly assert that in modernity, capitalism exists, but the underpinning theological forces that drove it during the Reformation do not. In order to speculate on the reasons for this transformation, we must examine capitalism in modernity. Modern thought has been markedly distinguished by empiricism. Perhaps Darwin's publication of The Origin of the Species in 1859 was a crucial event in the transformation from religious to empirical thinking. Darwin's theory seemed to invalidate the literalness of biblical events such as the creation of man by God and original sin. Natural occurring events that were once attributed to God's will were now attributed to a process of evolution. Indeed, the Westminster Convention cited earlier seems to be invalidated by Darwin. According to Darwin, man was a growth of a species, not a manufacture of God. The social Darwinists sought to explain Smith's vision of capitalism as a naturalized system by describing society as a social organism. Herbert Spencer, a forerunner of this movement, elucidates the connection between Darwin's principles and society. Quote, Yet that societies are not artificially put together is a truth so manifest that it seems wonderful men should have ever overlooked it. You need but to look at the changes going on around or observe social organization and its leading peculiarities to see that these are neither supernatural nor are determined by the wills of individual men, as by implication historians commonly teach, but are consequent on general natural courses under all its aspects, and through all its ramifications. Society is a growth, and not a manufacture." End quote. Indeed, the specific traits of capitalism, namely supply and demand and the division of labor, were argued as naturally occurring by Smith and Spencer alike. Spencer portrays the division of labor in an anthropomorphic description society, quote, "A function to each organ and each organ to its own action, is the law of all organization. Our highly developed apparatus for the distribution of commodities is similarly distinguished by the subdivision of duties." End quote. Thus, with the application of Darwin's theory of evolution we begin to see a more empirical way of understanding this capitalistic system. Earlier we argued that the Protestant reformer individuated by severing his bonds with the Catholic Church. One could argue that this Protestant individuation could be understood as a rational theological inclination. Individual decisions were based on theological inclinations, not empirical proofs. Indeed, the belief in God could not be validated scientifically. Insert Darwin, and what was once seen a theological inclination was now seen as a scientific tendency. Spencer asserts that individuation is a biological tendency, quote, "The development of society, as well as the development of man and the development of life generally may be described as a tendency to individuate, to become a thing." End quote. It is arguable that during this endless process of individuation, work as an end in itself became so consuming that its religious motives were lost in the process. Science now explained what was once thought to be the works of God. One could speculate that God was seen as an imposing external power that could only inhibit the accumulation of empirical knowledge. Indeed, religion, empirically invalid, was a barrier to this accumulation. Indeed, the desire for human freedom, accumulating just like everything else, could not leave a place for God. Erich Fromm elucidates this desire for freedom and its repercussions, quote, "We are fascinated by the growth of freedom from powers outside ourselves, and blinded to the fact of inner restraints, compulsions, and fears, which tend to undermine the meaning of the victories freedom has won against its traditional enemies." End quote. These inner anxieties and horrors surfaced during the end of the Industrial Revolution, a time where the accumulation hysteria reached such a peak that not only its religious motives were lost, but the ceaseless production seemed to lack any motive whatsoever. It was only then where we see the emergence of a therapeutic age, which seeks to empirically analyze man's life, which had become utterly meaningless. Modern man understands this transition to modern capitalism as a change in man's social character. David Reisman understands the span of people we have just examined, the Protestant reformer to the men of the Industrial Revolution, as inner directed, quote, "The inner directed man can justify his existence not only by what he has done, but what he will do." End quote. In depicting the insecurity of the inner directed Protestant reformer, Reisman suggests that, quote, "The Puritan inner directed man was made to feel as if he had constantly to hold on to himself, that without ceaseless vigilance he would let go and drift, on the assumption that one can let go if one wills, or, rather, if one stops willing. It is as if his character, despite its seeming stability, did not feel stable, and, indeed, the Puritan, in a theological projection of this inner feeling, had constantly to fight against doubts concerning his state of grace or election." End quote. In the time span we have examined, we have observed a transition from a religious to an empirical world through loss of God. Strikingly enough, Reisman refers to this period in which these inner directed types lived as transitional growth. Reisman asserts, quote, "Transitional growth is a mild way of putting it. The transition is likely to be violent, disrupting the stabilized paths of existence in societies." End quote. Indeed, this might be one way of describing a time where a multi-century-old God had been shoved out of society. In this way,